Uganda is now drilling for oil with the Chinese, among others, led by Total Energies from France in the very controversial East Africa crude oil pipeline. And that has generated a lot of controversy, particularly from Europeans. But it doesn't seem like that President Museveni has any concern whatsoever about what Europeans or Americans or anybody else thinks of his economic plan. And in his address at the event, he laid out why this power facility is so important as part of the larger objective to really foster economic development in Uganda.
The banks, especially for agriculture and for manufacturing. The money from the banks must not be high interest rates, because if it is high interest rates, how will you make profit? That's why for the government insisted on UDB, borrow from UDB, borrow from Myoga, from PDM, have nothing to do with the money lenders. Those money lenders are your enemies.
As much as Chinese policy banks fund a lot of large-scale turnkey projects, which means, you really should, at the end of the day, just turn the key and have the project working, it's still important to have experienced professionals on ground overseeing the project. So, that level of experience and expertise needs to be maintained.
China is producing huge amounts of solar energy capacity, and increasingly it's facing tariff pressures all over the global north. Even the US is now slapping tariffs on solar panels not made by China but made in Southeast Asia. Quite high tariffs, actually. And so the solar panels and other components are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And Africa is the one place that can actually benefit from this. Also from the pressures that these producers are facing elsewhere, which would sweeten the deal in Africa. So this really is a window of huge opportunity for the continent to rapidly electrify. And we'll see whether they are able to do it.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, joining us today from beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, there are two contrasting energy stories playing out right now across southern Africa this week. In Zambia, millions of people have been grappling with massive power outages, sometimes lasting as long as 3 days. And this has been an issue that has been building up over the past 6-7 months and really intensifying to the point where millions of people now are without power for prolonged periods of time. And a lot of this due to a dramatic drop in energy produced by the Karuma Hydropower Station on the Zambezi River. This is a critically important power facility that produces energy for both Zambia and Zimbabwe. And we've been discussing the power outages in Zimbabwe for a long time, and now those same problems are afflicting large swaths of Zambia. The problem here is that a prolonged drought brought on by climate change has reduced the water levels in the Zambezi River, making it impossible for the Kariba's generators to run and produce electricity. And the situation now is so dire that the government is calling on the mining industry to cut back its use of electricity, which will only further exacerbate the country's economic crisis. So there's a real potential here, Cobus, of an economic death spiral that's going to be very difficult, where power shuts down, the copper then doesn't generate the revenue, the debts then get larger, and President Hakainde Hichilema cannot fulfill the promises he made in his campaign to turn this economy around. That's the situation in Zambia. Now, a totally different story in Uganda, where last week there were large celebrations for the commissioning of the Karuma Hydropower Plant. Construction began back in 2013. And Cobus, this is a warning for all of those countries in Europe, the US, Japan, and elsewhere that say they're going to compete with the Chinese to build infrastructure in the global south. And just like here in Ho Chi Minh City, where they broke ground on the Saigon Metro in 2012 when I first arrived in this country, and we still don't have a metro, it has taken 11 years to build and to get the Karuma power plant going. And now this week, though, after all of the delays, it was finally commissioned and put into service. Now, this is a 200 megawatt power station, and it takes the country's output from 1,400 megawatts to 2,000 megawatts. There was a very big celebration at the facility, and I want to bring you a little bit of the sound. And Cobus, I want you to respond to some of these statements we're going to play from some of the different key stakeholders. Let's first hear from Chinese Ambassador to Uganda, Zhang Li-zhong.
We are very happy to be here to witness the presidential commissioning of the flagship project of China-Uganda Pragmatic Cooperation, the 600 megawatts Karuma Hydropower Station and the Karuma Interconnection Project. This is a historical moment in energy development of Uganda. It is also a long-awaited success. Warm congratulations, Your Excellency, and to the government of Uganda. Electricity matters everywhere, and hydropower, featured by low cost, zero pollution, and high utilization efficiency, is globally recognized as a clean, high quality, and flexible renewable energy source. Karuma Hydropower Project would not only connect millions of households with affordable electricity, supply power for some of the most dynamic industrial areas in Uganda, and promote its green economic transformation, but also give the Pearl of Africa a huge boost as a regional electricity hub and contribute to sustainable clean energy for East African development.
So Ambassador Zhang talked about Uganda becoming an energy hub, and the reason why he said that is because there's talks now underway for the Karuma Power Plant and for Uganda to start exporting power to South Sudan and to other neighboring countries that have considerably less power than Uganda now does. Now, we also heard from Minister of Energy and Mineral Development, Ruth Nankabira, and she explained the economics of the new facility. And that's been a big question about the debt that the country is going to take on to pay for this. So it was about $1.7 billion, and then there was $500 or $600 million in extra fees that came because of the delays. Still, the minister says it was a good deal.
People would like to know how much this project has taken and probably how much the tariff will cost. I would like to mention that we were lucky, and I want to thank the president, who insisted that we use part of the money from the energy fund and co-invest it into this plant by 15%. We got money, a loan financed from the Exim Bank of China, which contributed the 85%, $1.435 billion of the engineering, procurement, and construction cost, while our 15% was $253.26 million. That brings it to the total of $1.688.38 billion. We are grateful to the People's Republic of China for the significant support and walking the journey with us through Sinohydro, a Chinese contractor whom have been introduced here today. We appreciate the great cooperation.
Cobus, it's always so interesting when you hear from stakeholders at events like this what a different tone there is to the discourse about China and Africa than what we hear not only in the US and Europe, but in other parts of Africa as well, where there's so much focus on debt traps and exploitation and whatnot. And here we have an event where everybody seems very sober about the costs of producing this facility, but also the enormous benefits that come to a region that is starved of power.
Yeah, it's interesting for me. It's like clearly we're in an era where African officials are under a lot of pressure to be a lot more transparent and explicit about the loans they take out, particularly if it's Chinese loans. So it's interesting to hear them kind of putting the numbers right up front during the opening ceremony. It's clearly it's a while after something like the standard gauge railway in Kenya, for example.
So this all fits as part of President Yoweri Museveni's larger plan to turn Uganda into an energy production hub. We talked about that from the Ambassador Zhang, but also let's not forget that Uganda is now drilling for oil with the Chinese, among others, led by Total Energies from France in the very controversial East Africa crude oil pipeline. And that has generated a lot of controversy, particularly from Europeans. But it doesn't seem like that President Museveni has any concern whatsoever about what Europeans or Americans or anybody else thinks of his economic plan. And in his address at the event, he laid out why this power facility is so important as part of the larger objective to really foster economic development in Uganda.
If you want a modern economy, because the goods you produce must be good quality and cheap. Otherwise, people will not buy your products, they will buy the products of others. In the past, we were buying goods from Europe. But if you look for goods from Europe now, they are not there. Many of the manufactured goods are now coming from China, from India, from other places. How were the Europeans chased out of manufacturing? High costs. Their vehicles are very expensive. They think that, forget about the Europeans. Of course, for the Europeans, the biggest problem, one of their biggest problems was that they were paying themselves very high salaries. Because very high salaries are also another problem. If you pay yourself too high salaries, what you produce will not be affordable. That was part of the problem of the Europeans because they don't listen. They think they know everything. Therefore, number one, ensure low transport costs. Number two, ensure low costs of electricity. Have cheap, reliable, affordable electricity. Number three, the cost of money in the banks, especially for agriculture and for manufacturing. The money from the banks must not be high interest rates. Because if it is high interest rates, how will you make profit? That's why for the government insisted on UDB, borrow from UDB, borrow from Myoga, from PDM, have nothing to do with the money lenders. Those money lenders are your enemies.
There you go, Cobus. Those money lenders are the enemies. And in case you're not sure who he's talking about, those are the Eurobonds. Those are the private creditors, the banks, all of them. And so interesting, Museveni's got this kind of Trump style of delivery where he is at a stage in his life where he just doesn't have any more F's to give. And he just kind of sits up there and just lets it go, which is very interesting. But this question of the focusing on what it takes to get that economy going, transportation, electricity, and low cost of capital. And this is where, again, the Chinese come in. Remember, Africa is a continent that has the lowest electrification in the world and is in the midst, as we heard about in Zambia, of a power crisis. In fact, it's the only place in the world with declining electrification. Whereas here in Southeast Asia, in South America, and other developing regions, power supplies are going up. Over 40% of the continent's population does not have access to electricity, with almost all of that in sub-Saharan Africa. So when the Chinese come in and they've built 25 gigawatts of generation capacity in Africa, making up about 15% of sub-Saharan Africa's total installed generation capacity, it's very important. Now, how do African governments, like what we just heard in Uganda, negotiate to get the best deals, negotiate the lowest rates for all this? That has been a question that we've been following for more than a decade. And Cobus, you and I spoke with one of our close friends of the program, Oxford University's Folashade Sule, who's looked into the negotiating capacities of various African stakeholders and how that's led to different outcomes. Well, there is a new piece of research that's come out on this. Africa takes the wheel, the role of host states in shaping outcomes of Chinese-supported power generation projects in Africa, that was published earlier this year by the Boston University's Global Development Policy Center and written by Adjekai Adjei, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business and previously a Global China Pre-Doctoral Research Fellow with BU's Global Development Policy Center. Adjekai, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. It's wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking with you.
It's great. So you heard me do the setup there, and the timing of our show today, which was coincidental because we planned this weeks and weeks ago, but at the same time, here we are 1 week after they just commissioned the Karuma Power Station. You focused on the Karuma Hydropower Plant in Uganda, and you also talked about the Bui Hydropower Plant in Ghana. Those were your two case studies. Why did you pick those two projects to talk about the agency of the different stakeholders who negotiated these deals with Chinese financiers?
So basically, I chose these two case studies because of the varying outcomes that each country experienced. So basically, Ghana seemed to have experienced more positive project outcomes in that the building of the dam, it was built largely according to schedule, I think about 3 months delayed, which is not bad for a mega project of that scale. In terms of cost, it was quite cost competitive when compared to similar projects in the region. And in terms of quality, the dam experienced very few defects or quality challenges, the Bui Dam that is. But when looking at the Karuma Power Plant, the outcomes weren't quite as positive. As you mentioned, the dam has been quite delayed. The costs have been a bit higher when compared to kind of some regional averages. And then also there were some quality challenges. But what was most interesting was that these dams were built by the same contractor, being China's Sino-Hydro, and it was financed by the same financier, being Checksum, so China Export-Import Bank. So basically we have the same Chinese actors, but we had very different outcomes for the two countries, which made it interesting to compare and try and understand why and what is it that these states are doing or not doing that contributed to these outcomes.
This is such a fascinating project. You break down some of these dynamics into different phases: the policy and planning phase, the brokering and negotiating phase, and the implementation and management phase. So I wonder if you could talk us through what some of the contrasts are between Ghana and Uganda that you picked up in these different phases, maybe starting with the policy and planning one.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there were different phases, kind of starting from the beginning of the project and seeing how the project kind of rolled out throughout. And I think that was very deliberate because we see that there has been a lot of focus in the beginning stages being the brokering and negotiation, and kind of trickle down or trail down as the project develops and the extent of agency or how much the African host status actually has been leading the project. So looking at policy and planning, kind of the key differences that we found was that from a policy perspective, both countries did prioritize building their projects within their policy framework. So that was good on both ends. In terms of the planning perspectives, at the time when this project was being envisioned by Uganda, they didn't have an existing planning framework, an electricity planning framework, whereas Ghana did have that electricity planning framework, and Bui was built into one of those scenarios. So overall, there was policy alignment by both countries. The planning, it was featured in Uganda's National Development Plan, but there wasn't a specific planning framework or from the energy perspective. So policy and planning was fine on both ends. Brokering and engagement was very interesting because it was quite similar, both projects having presidential, not intervention, but involvement. Yeah, presidential involvement. So we saw that in terms of brokering the engagement for Uganda, President Museveni is seen to have had discussions with President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the BRICS Forum in 2013. And from the Ghanaian perspective, a presidential delegation did visit China seeking support for the Bui Dam. So from brokering and negotiation, we both see presidential interventions or involvement at that side. However, the difference was that it came down to kind of the competitive procurement aspects. So when President Museveni did engage with President Xi Jinping, this was when a competitive procurement process had already been launched, and that process had a lot of difficulties. Whereas from the Ghanaian side, there was a competitive procurement, but it failed because there was only one potential bidder. So that process wasn't interrupted. That process actually came to an end, whereas we saw President Museveni's intervention coming during the procurement process. So those were the key differences there. But I'd like to perhaps highlight kind of the two key aspects where we saw differences, the largest being in the project implementation side. So I've skipped a few phases just to get you to just kind of the meat of it. So in the terms of project implementation, we saw the countries adopt very kind of different approaches in terms of their oversight, monitoring, and implementation of the project. In Uganda, when the project was started, it was under kind of the purview of the Ministry of Energy. And as I understand it, there were two engineers, electrical engineers in the ministry that were responsible for overseeing this project. In terms of the consultant or external support that they had appointed a contractor who didn't quite have the experience. I believe the contractor had built a road in their hometown, which is quite not comparable to building a huge power project of this magnitude. And so from a capacity perspective, you see two electrical engineers who generally aren't in charge of, structural aspects such as these. You have a consultant who isn't also quite equipped to be lending the support that the country needed at the beginning stages. This did change later on when the generating company, the Uganda Electricity Generation Company, did take over the project from the ministry. But at very crucial stages, we didn't have the correct project implementation oversight from the Ugandan counterparties. Contrasting this to Ghana's experience, we had, for example, Ghana had a lead engineer who had specifically researched this project, the development of the Bui Dam, one, during his master's, two, there was a very experienced owner's engineer, so the consultant on the Ghanaian side that was supporting them. They had previously worked with Sino Hydro on implementing a similar project, but in a different country. And then also Ghana adopted quite a proactive approach in terms of engaging with the project. In my interviews, one of the interviewees mentioned Ghana was really there, or the Ghanaian counterparties were really on the field. For every Chinese engineer, there was at least one Ghanaian engineer working on the ground. Testing was happening together. Mixing of concrete was happening together. And so it was quite a lot more interactive, whereas on the Ugandan side, it was a lot more hands-off in the beginning because Uganda was a turnkey project. And I think this project implementation side approaches really impacted on the quality outcomes and the time outcomes of the project.
I mentioned at the beginning of the show that Folashade Sule at Oxford University had done research on negotiating strategies and the different skill sets of African negotiators with their Chinese parts, and how the outcomes oftentimes, even within a single country, would vary depending on the capabilities of the negotiators on the other side of the table from the Chinese. You talk about brokering and negotiating, and I'm curious if the competence of the Ghanaian and Ugandan negotiators, in terms of their understanding of Chinese development finance, familiarity with Sino Hydro, and, did that play a factor in affecting the differences that we saw in Uganda and Ghana in terms of the outcomes that were different, as your research revealed?
Yeah, so I think I would say that it did. In terms of, if we're looking at the finance agreements, we can see not very, but different financial arrangements to a degree that the parties achieved. But both parties were successful and unsuccessful in some aspects of their negotiations. So, for example, Ghana was successful in reducing the counterpart funding, so how much it needed to contribute to the project, and was unsuccessful in negotiating the interest on the commercial loan down, right? Whereas on the Ugandan side, they were quite successful in reducing that interest rate, which was great. And the Ugandan counterparties also adopted a house view, as I understand, not to put up any collateral for the loan, which was, again, something that Ghana chose to do differently. And Ghana chose to didn't choose to put up any natural resources, that is their oil, as collateral. Whereas Ghana did choose to put up natural resources as a means to repay the loan and put up their cocoa, and did so with the intention of creating new markets to export their cocoa. So both countries kind of had places where they were successful, and they had aspects where they were less successful in negotiating the finance agreement, but also adopted very different approaches in terms of how they wanted to repay the loan. So the capacities and approaches did differ, which also illustrates the flexibility and also importance of these negotiations and understanding really what you can achieve through them.
It was very interesting for me that the comparison was also happening with the same Chinese contractor. And you pointed out that, the higher level of involvement on the Ghanaian side also ended up resulting in better technical and, output implementation results. So what kind of conclusion did that bring you to about the work of the contractor itself? Like, what were some of the factors leading to worse technical outcomes on the Ugandan side? Is it a situation where one literally has to have government intervention or government kind of like involvement directly there to avoid corner cutting, or what were some of the factors involved in the different outcomes?
I think to a large extent, when I engaged with the Ghanaian counterparties, they'd mentioned that it was important to be on the same page with the contractors for them, and it was important that the project was implemented in the way that they envisioned. And saying that, and he even mentioned, there were times when they would actually just down tools and like everybody would stop working because there was kind of a misalignment in terms of what the parties wanted to do and to achieve. So I think it's very much about just aligning the expectations quite closely and working together to ensure that, the outcomes are as both parties envision and that the outcomes are balanced.
How much do you think the experiences of Uganda and Ghana with these two hydropower projects applies to other African countries who are dealing not only with Sinohydro and China Exim Bank, but ICBC, China Development Bank, and other Chinese stakeholders? How much do you think that lessons can be learned from these two countries that can apply more broadly across the continent?
Yeah, I think these lessons are really directly applicable to kind of any country wanting to engage with Chinese actors and investors in building these type of projects. I think key lessons coming out is just about African host states really kind of having ownership over the projects and really being intentional about ensuring that the project outcomes are, one, what they require, what they envisioned, and also are balanced so that they also benefit the Chinese contractor, who at the end of the day are investors and are looking to have some positive outcome for themselves. But yeah, key lessons can be drawn out of this for all parties or all host states trying to engage with Chinese investors, really about upping, the technical capacity, being on site all the time, because I think that was something that also happened in Uganda where they weren't daily on the site. So I think it's technical capacity, it's about, direct involvement. And it's also, as you mentioned, about negotiating capacity to really get deals or projects that have positive project outcomes for all.
Those sound like very standard types of lessons that one would learn. Is there anything specific to the Chinese, or what you're saying also applies to African contractors and Western and Turkish contractors as well? Or is there anything that is really, truly distinctive that came out of your research that is unique to the Chinese? Maybe not. I mean, it's just good negotiating is good negotiating, right? I mean, so it wasn't meant to actually be a trick question. It was, but it's just, I'm just curious. And maybe, Cobus, you might have something to say on this, because one of the things that we've heard in terms of, for example, the contracts, where Professor Deborah Browdegem at Johns Hopkins has said much of the language and the structure and the formatting of the contracts is based on Swiss corporate law. In many respects, there's nothing that exceptional about Chinese contracts. The opacity, of course, but even the non-disclosure agreements, not that unusual. So I'm wondering, when we look at these types of negotiations, are there any traits, Cobus, that you've seen over the years that are unique to the Chinese, or do we just need to have better negotiators?
It's so difficult for me to answer, actually.
Again, not meant to be a trick question.
As far as I know, and I'm very much not an expert, but as far as I can see, there's a lot of standard issues that a more interventionist or a more kind of like proactive African government position would help with. And then I think there are kind of also specific factors in dealing with Chinese contractors, of which, basic things like language, for example, is a key one. So it seems to me that it's kind of both at the same time. Adjekai, what do you think?
I think I would agree. So looking into the Chinese contracts that I have seen, a lot of it is quite standard, and I just echoing what you said, there's obviously challenges around the opacity, with doing, looking into Chinese projects. But, the non-disclosure clauses and the confidentiality clauses, those are pretty standard. So there's a lot of elements that are quite standard, though I think the one aspect that stood out to me when I was reviewing some agreements was the cross-default clauses. So basically a cross-default clause basically says that if you fail to pay any amount that's due in terms of your other obligations, that default will then trigger defaults in your other contracts. And I hope that makes sense. Yeah. So from a financing perspective, that's pretty standard, but it's usually related to, financial obligations. Whereas in one of the contracts that I was looking at, it was that if there was a kind of default or not severing of diplomatic relations, but also if a project was being negotiated and that was removed from the table or whatever, that could cause a cross default, which was very different because usually if you don't pay something, that would trigger that. So basically maintaining that relationship with China was quite important, and that was built into the contract that I saw, which obviously differed quite a lot from, standard loan market association finance agreements that I'd worked with previously.
And that's also similar to the escrow requirements that the Chinese oftentimes require on a lot of their loans, where they require the borrowing country to put a significant amount of money so that if there is a default or a delay in payment, they can draw from those escrow accounts. And we just saw that, in fact, recently in Angola, where the Angolan government and the China Development Bank reached an agreement to use some of the escrow money to service the current debt. And so that's a little bit unusual compared to the others. Let's wrap up our discussion, just kind of a big picture, pulling back. You've had a few months now since the paper was published. What advice do you have for either the Ugandan, the Ghanaian, or other governments if they come to you and they say, Adjekai, you immersed yourself in this research, you're pursuing your PhD at UCT. What should we know about negotiating with the Chinese? What would you tell them?
Oh, that's a great one. So I would say, just as a starting point, and I think I mentioned it before, is just really having ownership of the project and being involved in every single step of the project. So not just from the brokering and negotiation, not just from the financial discussions, but also following up throughout the project on the day-to-day and being active there, I think is very much key. So not losing sight of just the happenings of the project. Secondly, I would say it's very important to make sure that, skilled and experienced, either in-house people or external consultants are working on the project. As much as Chinese policy banks fund a lot of large-scale turnkey projects, which means, you really should, at the end of the day, just turn the key and have the project working, it's still important to have experienced professionals on ground overseeing the project. So that level of experience and expertise needs to be maintained. And also linked to that, enhanced monitoring and evaluation models. Overall, just own the project and ensure that it's a project at the end of the day is what you wanted, and it's something that you can be proud of. And also know that it's not due, but you should kind of exercise your skill and capacity and to ensure that it's the project that you wanted.
Those are fantastic points there. The paper is The Role of Host States in Shaping Outcomes of Chinese-Supported Power Generation Projects in Africa. It was written by Adjekai Adjei, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town at their Graduate School of Business. And she wrote this paper when she was a Global China Predoctoral Research Fellow at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. We're going to put a link to it in the show notes. Adjekai, thank you so much for taking the time, and congratulations on the great work. And we wish you the best of luck with your PhD program.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for having this very interesting show going on. I really do love to tune in. Thank you.
Cobus, what a treat for us to have the chance to speak with Adjekai. And it's great for us to have the chance to really showcase the work of this new generation of scholars coming up. And I'm just so excited to follow Adjekai's work going forward. The report is fantastic. I mean, and I encourage anybody who's interested in this question of not only China-Africa energy engagement, but also, again, this negotiating capacity. And Adjekai is building on the work of what Folashade did earlier. And I think there's not enough dedicated to understanding the importance of governance capacity. This is not just in the negotiating skills, but also in terms of, as she talked about, the project management, the supervision, the feasibility studies, all of that goes into it, because we've seen in so many cases, I'm thinking of Edgar Lungu, the former president of Zambia, building infrastructure projects financed by the Chinese, built by the Chinese, that were just moronic. I mean, just not well thought out. And so to have that really competent governance that she kind of kept coming back to in terms of skilled negotiators, project management, project oversight, implementation, and so forth, absolutely critical. I mean, and I get a sense that she was not disappointed by what she saw in both Uganda and Ghana to some varying degrees, but at the same time, I think there's some positive takeaways here.
Definitely. I think one of the big takeaways for me is this realization that, to a certain extent, the idea that if one is a very undercapacitated African country without a local skills base, that you can then work with China and they can step in and provide you a project that you don't necessarily have the skills for, that is a little bit of a false narrative. Like, it's clear, like her work shows, that you need your own set of skills, your own skills pool, in order to then work with the Chinese on a level where you need to, right? So Ghana succeeded not only because they had competent bureaucrats and technocrats in place to oversee the process, but actually also because they had engineers, and they had like a one-to-one number of engineers that they could actually then have on site and enforce the implementation of the project on a day-to-day basis. You know, so if one ends up as an African country, as many African countries are, that where you don't, for example, have an engineer skills base, then that is part of the problem, and kind of working with the Chinese to provide a project isn't necessarily going to help that particular problem.
It is quite remarkable looking up the statistics that she cited in her paper about the amount that the Chinese have done in Africa, and it's impressive. 15% of sub-Saharan Africa's total installed generation capacity is produced by the Chinese. 25 gigawatts is produced by Chinese financing, Chinese constructed, and some Chinese level of engagement. That, again, for a continent that is literally shrinking in terms of the access of power, is remarkable. I mean, it's just remarkable that in the 21st century, that regions as large as Africa are diminishing in terms of their access to electricity. I mean, we can't get our heads around that, you know, because it doesn't happen anywhere else in the world.
Well, exactly. And, you know, this also obviously has a huge climate implication, you know, because the people who don't have access to electricity, a lot of them manage to cook through burning wood, right? So environmentally, this is bad on several different levels at once. But it is interesting in this moment that, you know, I was wondering how long this trend of de-electrification is gonna go on, because we're moving into an era where, you know, China is producing huge amounts of solar energy capacity, and increasingly it's facing tariff pressures all over the global north. Even the US is now slapping tariffs on solar panels not made by China but made in Southeast Asia. You know, quite high tariffs actually. And so the solar panels and other components are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And Africa is the one place that can actually benefit from this, you know, from the pressures that these producers are facing elsewhere, which would sweeten the deal in Africa. So this really is a window of huge opportunity for the continent to rapidly electrify. And we'll see whether they're able to do it.
Yes, it is, but it is potentially, but it's not just about solar panels. It's about, you know, storage. It's about distribution. So we have a situation here in Vietnam where they are generating huge amounts of electricity from solar now, but the distribution network is antiquated and can't keep up with it.
Yes.
And there's no storage capacity. So, I mean,
when one speaks with green energy people, it's grids, you know, and you need to reconfigure existing grids. You need to make them smart. It's a whole story, but yeah. And one need, again, you know, as Adjekai's work shows, you need a certain like base level of technical skills, of a skills pool in your own country to make sure that all of this is done correctly, you know, which in the case of solar is frequently a problem in Africa.
Well, as I've been mentioning for the past several weeks on the show, we are about to release a brand new, beautiful, amazing China-Africa energy interactive map that will show you all of the different projects, construction initiatives, financing deals across Africa for the past 2 or 3 years. I think it goes back 3 years. I'll confirm on that. It's about to launch in a few weeks. We will, of course, have a lot of announcements when it's finally out, but Adjekai's research is absolutely central to this, and our discussion today will complement the map that we're going to release. But this is all part of the work that the China Global South Project is doing, and it couldn't be done without your support. We want to thank everybody on Patreon for their support because we just couldn't do it without you. So thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. The best way, of course, to support and bolster the work that we're doing and to keep us alive. I mean, I don't take for granted that a service like ours can survive because we live on the edge, as every media company does today, is by subscribing. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. You can try it out free for a month. And if you are a student or a teacher, email me, Eric, ERIC, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links for half off discounts if you are a student or a teacher. Be sure to use your academic address when you send it to me. So for Cobus van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.